Is our justice unfair? That's our moral maze tonight. The panel, the commentator and campaigner Inaya Folarin Iman, Ash Sarkar from the Novara Media Group, the historian Tim Stanley, and the priest and polemicist Giles Fraser. Inaya, which side of this argument are you on?
I believe in equality under the law. And, for example, men commit the vast majority of crimes, yet no one seriously argues that anti-male discrimination is the cause. But the idea that disparities must mean discrimination is often applied when it comes to other identity groups that are overrepresented in certain crimes. I think this ignores the complex factors and encourages a culture of defeatism and victimhood amongst minority groups.
Ash Sarkar.
Well, I think the first mistake is to assume that who ends up in prison is a reflection of who commits the most crimes. I mean, wage theft robs this country of £35 billion annually, and yet there are far more shoplifters in prison. I think that we do have a two-tier justice system already. We know that people from ethnic minorities, people who are care experienced, people with mental health issues and people from deprived backgrounds are far more likely to end up in prison. And we should think about the ways in which prison reproduces, I suppose, unequal outcomes and isn't just a way of dealing with crime.
Giles Fraser.
I used to have a bedroom that looked out over the Old Bailey, and on the top of the Old Bailey there's a statue of Lady Justice holding scales, and she's blindfolded. And it seems to me rather important symbolically to say that, you know, no matter what god you worship, no matter how many chromosomes you've got, no matter whether your parents had a grouse moor or live in a block of flats, you'd be treated the same under the law. And I think that's a really important principle to maintain.
Tim Stanley.
I think this issue has been misrepresented. If we have a two-tier justice system, it's one that currently discriminates against non-whites, locking them up more often and for longer. And the fact that when someone points this out, politicians go all hang 'em and flog 'em about it, suggests that, maybe our country is a little bit prejudiced.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Kirsty Brimelow, who's a human rights and criminal law barrister and is vice chair of the Bar Council. She's on the line now. Kirsty Brimelow, do you think the reason there are disproportionately more black people, and I think Muslims, in jail is because the justice system is unfair, or is racist even?
Well, the data does show that if you are from an ethnic minority, including white ethnic minorities, then you are likely to get a higher prison sentence. Now, the reason for then somebody from a white heritage background, the reason for this disparity is not clear. And I know a number of suggestions have been put forward at the start of the programme, but it's not clear. And so therefore, all judges can do is get as much information as possible about somebody who is from a minority group. And the minority groups cover faith, they cover ethnicity, they cover pregnant women.
There is a bit, yes, quite a long list.
It's a huge list, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But
no, don't.
Yeah.
Stop
now.
there, in fact.
Yes.
Giles Fraser.
Isn't there some sort of fundamental principle that justice must be blind, that it must be there irrespective of background, where you come from, what your lot is in life? It's just, and the perception of justice being fair is somehow bound up with that justice being blind.
Well, I think to treat somebody fairly or treat people fairly doesn't mean you treat them exactly the same. It's important that they treated fairly. And so part of that means that you might need more information on somebody, in that you as a judge aren't as familiar with somebody as you are with somebody else, or you've got sufficient information on somebody else. So that is the whole basis of getting a pre-sentence report in court, to get as much information as possible to ensure that the sentence that is passed is one that is just. And that means that it's appropriate, it protects the public, it helps reduce crime, it's punitive, and also it might be a making of reparation by that particular offender to the person affected by the crime.
So if these things are so important, these pre-sentencing reports, why should they not be mandatory for everybody?
Well, in fact, the pre-sentence reports they generally are ordered unless they're thought to be unnecessary. So there is a presumption on ordering pre-sentence reports for everybody. And the sentencing guidelines, which have hit the headlines so much, all they do is list a number of groups. And I've stopped going through all of them because there are quite a number.
There are quite a number. I've got them here before me. But one of the things that's not mentioned is something like poverty or something like class.
Yeah.
And these would be really important indicators of, maybe important indicators of why you might want to mitigate, have mitigating circumstances for what you've done.
Yeah, in fact, that is in the guidelines. So the guideline is that pre-sentence reports are necessary in all cases where you are looking at the personal circumstances of the offenders, and that would include poverty. So if you've got some evidence before you that a defendant is from a particularly deprived background, that's a classic case where you would order a pre-sentence report to look into what is going on. Is there some reasoning behind their offending, and what reparation could then take place?
Just issue of clarification, sorry. I'm not quite sure whether they sort of always happen or they mostly happen, or whether you've got a hunch that someone's coming from a particular background, so you sort of order one. Why does this not just happen across the board?
It does happen across the board. So if a judge is considering custody or considering a community order, the presumption is in favour of ordering a pre-sentence report. And if a judge is considering that this is a case where you've mentioned poverty, where they want to know more information about the personal circumstances, a report is going to be ordered. So generally they are ordered, and all the sentencing guidelines does is it adds a number of cohorts, and those include cohorts of people who tend to come off quite badly in the criminal justice system, and says that you might want to get more information about those people in addition to the general populace where you order pre-sentence reports.
And so this would mitigate sentences and then lower sentences, basically, if you had this sort of report.
No, I mean, it doesn't. It gives alternatives. So
Okay.
it gives a range of sentencing options. So if you as a judge are thinking, well, I'm not sure, I might send this person to prison, but there might be something where a community order would work, then you would need to get a pre-sentence report where the probation officer interviews the
and
person.
you don't worry that the perception of justice, the perception of people being treated equally, is being fiddled about with here?
No, it makes it clearer. There's actually nothing new here, because there's an equal treatment bench book that as judges that they have to look at. And what you want is a treatment that is fair for everybody. And where there is worrying data showing that certain groups are disproportionately being sent to prison and are getting a rough time when it comes to sentencing, then it's quite right that the Sentencing Council says to the judge, just pause, just take a little moment. This is a category where you should be ordering a pre-sentence report to get more information.
Inaya.
Kirsty, would you say that some of this new guidelines is in part to essentially mitigate what is perceived of as unconscious biases amongst some judges?
I'm sure the reasons aren't clear as to why there's a disparity. But of course, judges are human, and you get a whole variety of judges, and it also applies to magistrates. You get a whole variety of people up and down the country.
Yeah.
So it's an attempt to get as much information on the person as possible. And yes, it might help address the disparity.
'Cause the reason that I ask you that is that, slightly left field, but I'm wondering what you think about this idea that actually fear of appearing bias can be just as dangerous as bias itself. What do you think about that idea?
I think in terms of having trust in a justice system, it depends who the fear is. If somebody's sitting in court...
Well, from the judges.
From the judges? Well... I think, to be honest, the courts, I'd invite you to go to a court. They're so busy. The judges are so, focusing on the person and getting the information and the sentencing.
Well, here's more detail.
Yes.
If these guidelines essentially embed the idea that the system is biased and that public servants should, some might say, put their thumb on the scale to correct it, I think it would be fair for some people to think that that is almost providing a cover for bad behaviour.
No, it's, the guidelines so that there is not disparity, or it minimises disparity
but Kirsty,
in sentence.
We've seen actually real-world examples of this. I mean, one of the cases that has blown in the news in the last few months is the grooming gang scandal, which many reports found that authorities hesitated to act, including policing authorities and other authorities, for fear of being labelled racist. So there's actually some real-world examples that show the anxiety of being perceived of as bias can actually, in some senses, let people off the hook.
Yeah, I think you're dealing with judges who are professional people. I mean, it's a very forensic job that is carried out, and when the sentence is passed, the reasons are given, and not only do you go through
but if it's
features, but if you just let me finish a moment, just to understand the sentencing. You look at culpability, you look at harm. The offence is going to go in a certain category, so you're looking at a certain range of sentencing. That sentencing is set by Parliament. There's also Court of Appeal authorities that you follow, and then you look at mitigation, where you look at aggravation, then you look at mitigation, and that the mitigation will include taking into consideration any other features, personal matters, personal mitigation. And also you will look at if somebody's in a minority group, you look at somebody's pregnant, if they've got children and so on.
Just to interject there, Kirsty, because what you've just said to me, that then makes me think that, well, why do you need these categories? If you've just acknowledged that it's a very professional job, it's a forensic job, that these judges are doing everything that they can, then why do we need to require particular identity categories to have this report if the judges actually, by and large, by the sound of it, are doing quite a good job?
I think they are doing a good job, but the reason to have guidelines is to ensure that there's consistency up and down the country, that the judges are applying the same guidelines. And all the guidelines are setting out is that the judge should have full information on the person that is before them that they are sentencing. That's all a pre-sentence report is. It is not dictating to the judge the sentence that they pass. And it might be, and so I've seen many, many pre-sentence reports that have not been at all helpful to my client.
Okay.
And therefore the judge, and I've had to say, please ignore that. The person just didn't get on very well with the probation officer. They're not as bad as has been written down.
Kirsty Brimelow, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Henry Hill, who's deputy editor of Conservative Home website. What's your argument against these new guidelines, in principle and in practice?
Well, in principle, the Sentencing Council is basically something Parliament should not really have ended up setting up, because they have outsourced their control over sentencing to the Sentencing Council. And in fact, its guidelines, which judges are obliged to follow, so guidelines is perhaps a strong word for them, is often setting maximum sentences or advised maximum sentences which are below the maximum sentences set out in primary legislation. So they are directly usurping the legislative function. And in this particular case, it is embedding, effectively, a new double standard for the treatment of witnesses. Now, it may be the case that there is structural reasons elsewhere in society upstream of the court system which leads to some disparate outcomes, and you tackle them there. You don't tackle them at the level of the actual courts.
Ash, so
I just want to dig into pre-sentencing reports specifically. So what they do is they say that a person's whole life, including previous convictions and other aggravating factors, have to be taken into account by the judge. What's your beef with that?
Well, because you'd hope that it happens anyway. Two, it happens in, I think, 4/5 of cases, but it overwhelmingly produces shorter sentences. Now, if you think that that's absolutely fine, then let them just become a standard thing that every single person has, right? If they're so harmless, if they're so just an addition to the system, why do we not just have them as a mandatory part of the system? The actual operational reality of them is that they reduce sentences.
I mean, what you've said is that they apply to 4/5 of cases, now they're just expanding them. So
they're not necessarily expanding them. They are removing judicial discretion. I do think it's slightly ironic that people are talking up the independence and the forensic scrutiny of the judges, when what these guidelines do is restrict their capacity to decide for themselves, the person who is actually trying the case, whether or not they're going to take one of these. But functionally, what they do in the overwhelming majority of cases is they are usually not legally necessary, but usually required to get a suspended sentence, and they're much more likely to deliver community sentences. So introducing these on a racial basis is absurd.
I mean, but we're not just talking about a racial basis, right? So, I mean, to broaden it out, do you think that there are people in this society who, for reasons beyond their control, don't get a fair shot at life?
beyond their control? What does a fair shot mean? That seems like a meaninglessly broad question.
So a fair shot might be if you were a victim of child abuse. I think you could agree with me that that's probably going to negatively impact your life chances. We know that people who wind up in prison are disproportionately, care experienced, victims of abuse themselves.
Unless you have diminished responsibility, then
That's a very high threshold.
Yes, exactly. Unless you have diminished responsibility, you're a moral agent capable of action. Lots of people manage to survive trauma without committing crimes, and so you should face the law on the same as everybody else. Because also, we keep talking about this as if the person in the dock is the subject of justice. It's not. It's the victim, right? If somebody who has a terrible life trauma and somebody who doesn't each violently mug someone, the victim has suffered the same crime and is entitled to the same justice.
But I mean, take something like being care experienced. So 25% of people in prison have gone through the care system. I think 16% of them have had 5 or more care placements, right? I think you could admit that that's a pretty challenging set of circumstances to grow up in. Are you really telling me that someone that had a stable background like me should be treated in the exact same way as someone who never knew loving parents?
Yeah, broadly, because otherwise, actually, I think the logic is the opposite of the one you suggest. If what you're telling me is that this person's background means that they are less able to control themselves, they are less able to obey the law, they have a higher propensity to commit crime, that's not a logic that ends with you treating them leniently in the justice system, right? That is a logic that leads to you treating them as a higher risk to society, because that's what you're saying they are.
So, I mean, if you take the class background of judges, right, 73% of senior judges are privately educated, and you look at the overrepresentation of people from the care system, victims of abuse, people from deprived backgrounds who are in the dock.
What do you mean by overrepresentation?
So people who end up in the criminal justice system are much more likely to have been raised in circumstances of poverty, to have been through the care system, to have experienced trauma than society at large, right? You're comfortable with the criminal justice system effectively being people from very well-off backgrounds passing custodial sentences on people from very deprived ones.
I think if you have an actual problem with the sentence, then you need to substantiate it, and if you can't substantiate it, then their class background is irrelevant. And I also dispute your use of the word overrepresented, because I don't care what the overall society stats are. The one that matters, if you want to claim that the court system and the justice system is biased, is the proportion of crimes they commit. Right? So if you want to argue that we have a systemically racist, sexist, whatever-ist system, then either show me a lot of people who are being wrongfully convicted from those backgrounds, or show me a lot of people not from those backgrounds who are committing the same crimes and getting away with it. Because if what you've actually got is people being prosecuted out of line with their overall share of society, but in line with the share of people committing those crimes, the justice system is doing its job, and any intervention should be at another level.
If the crime that somebody commits is linked to their background of deprivation, so for instance, crimes that women commit disproportionately are often linked to the fact that they are victims of domestic abuse, that they experience poverty, that they've got children.
I already answered.
You don't think that should be taken into account?
I already answered this one. What you're saying is that those people have higher propensity to commit crime, which, if anything, militates towards treating them less leniently, not more.
Tim Stanley?
Among those things that the Sentencing Council wants judges to consider are whether or not the person in the dock is a young adult, female, from an ethnic minority, pregnant, is a carer, transgender, as an addict, is from a different race, etc., etc. The list is very long. Why do you think that politicians and media have only leapt on the race bit?
I've got no idea, to be honest. Probably because it's the one that has the highest salience in terms of public perception of violent crime and so on. But I think the entire thing is noxious. And if you want to be angry at those politicians, please invite one of them.
No, but you work for a media organisation. I do as well, and I just have noticed. And does it not imply that there is indeed a prejudice running through society with relation to crime and justice? That the alarm is sounded when there's any implication of being more lenient on people from an ethnic minority, rather than, say, pregnant women or people who are addicts.
I mean, I'll repeat my previous answer. I think that if you have a substantive problem with if you have a substantive charge about the operation of the justice system, then you need to evidence it. And if you don't, I don't think we should have a two-tier system on the basis of a vague inference.
Okay. This is a list of the things I read out, that society generally considers to be indications of someone being a vulnerable person. Now, I know you're going to accuse me of repeating what Ash was investigating, but I'm going to go into it in a different way. Okay. But do you not accept that we should, when considering the verdict, should we not consider some of those things that in other circumstances society considers as indices of someone being vulnerable?
Well, the reason that we have judicial discretion in the first place is that it allows for some element of that, right? Otherwise, we could simply have Parliament set a mandatory schedule of sentences, which nobody is suggesting. What is wrong in this case is formalising a difference on the basis of certain categories. Right? And second, I will repeat what I said to I will repeat what I said to Ash. If you're arguing that these people, because of their characteristics, are more likely to commit crime, then frankly, from the perspective of the criminal justice system, that doesn't matter.
No, I'm sorry. I don't think that's what Ash is saying. That's not what I'm saying either. What I'm saying is, and this is where I want to... Now, hang on. Now you're putting words in my mouth. Let's move... I want to move on slightly from the justice to the greater moral question. Do you not believe that when it comes to what I would call sin, there is context and mitigating circumstances to an action?
Sure.
So, for example, there are different kinds of murder because there are different circumstances and different motivations.
Yes.
Someone who murders in self-defense, this is recognized in the justice system.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So, for example, if someone is stealing food because they are addicted to heroin, or to feed their family because they've been kicked out by their husband and they're with their child, that's different, isn't it, to someone who steals food because they just don't want to pay for it?
To an extent, but not necessarily to the extent that I think you're talking about, because it's not just about them, right? It's about the victim. The victim of the theft has suffered the same crime, and is, I think, strongly entitled to the same justice.
Yes.
So there is some case for mitigating circumstances, but again, this conversation.
But first of all, we do not have a victim. We do not have a justice system.
But you're talking about sin.
No, come on. Well, because
our system isn't based on sin either.
No, okay, but hang on. But we're not based on a victim system in the sense that the victim says, "I feel this was done, and I want this to be the punishment." It's purposely done by the blind third-party judge. That's why. So the victim is one consideration, but it's not the only consideration. And there might be some victims who actually do want those things to be considered. If they discover that the person who did this to them has dreadful mitigating circumstances, would you not be tempted to say, I'd rather they had a lesser sentence?
I mean, me personally, if it was me?
Yeah.
I mean...
If you discovered your wallet had been stolen by someone who needed to feed their kids, wouldn't you feel more differently than if they'd been stolen because they just wanted your money?
Probably less than you'd like me to. But I think the point that I was making is simply not. I didn't say that we have an actual individually victim-led system. We don't. But what we do have is a system in which the part of the purpose of the system is the defence of the capital V victim, the abstract victim, right? The general victim, right? The idea of the victim, if you like. And so I think a lot of this conversation, one of the slightly frustrating things about it is it's a bit like the debate around excluding children, right, in school, and everyone's only talking about the child being excluded, and that's not actually the point. The point of this justice system is ultimately the protection of the public. If there are injustices further up the system that are leading to the inputs into that system in terms of the percentage of different groups committing crimes, then by all means tackle them further up. But the purpose of the justice system is to protect the public and punish the guilty.
Henry Hill, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Sheldon Thomas, who founded and runs an organisation called Gangline, which works to try to keep young black men from a life of crime. And he was indeed a gangster himself quite a long time ago now. He's on the line now. Sheldon Thomas, very, very briefly, please, why do you think so many young black men are in prison?
As the Lammy report wrote in 2017, the criminal justice system as a whole, and not just the criminal justice system, but the society that we live in, is systemically racist and has been from I was a child, where I suffered physical, psychological abuse by racist police officers and the National Front. It may not happen in the same way today in terms of racist police officers being so verbal and violent, but the system by which they operate and the criminal justice system is systemically racist. And what tends to happen is you always have white people who have never lived in this lifestyle, never been discriminated against, try to make it sound like we have a fair system, but they have never been discriminated, so they're not in a position to talk about what a fair system really is, if they've never really suffered injustice in the way black men have suffered.
I understand. Inaya.
Sheldon, if racism is the main factor holding black men down, which is, what you seem to be suggesting, why are black, British, West Africans doing so much better than black Caribbeans when it comes to their socioeconomic outcomes?
Well, it all depends because, as far as I know now, Africans are not doing very well. In fact, we have more African gang members, gang members doing county lines in from London. So I'm not quite sure because back when I was at school, yes, you're right. African kids were in fact, they were on the top of the class along with the Asian kids. That was in the 70s and 80s. As soon as the 2000s era period came in, there was a decline in Africans doing well in school. So if you go to any inner city area in London or in Birmingham or in Manchester or Liverpool, that's the places where I work, the evidence would suggest that things are actually changing for African families.
Yeah, well, I think it's very interesting, this idea that they are changing. I mean, I've looked even just today that in 2022, Black African children achieve far higher educational outcomes than their white British counterparts and their Black Caribbean counterparts. So obviously, I don't want to just get this into a debate about evidence, but there does seem to suggest that Black Africans are outperforming Black Caribbeans quite substantially. And I guess the question would be then, to what extent can racism be the primary determiner or explanatory factor?
Okay, simple. Your answer, let's just go by what you're saying. Your evidence is different to mine. Let's just go by that. The evidence also suggests those Africans and the Caribbeans who are in university and leaving with first and 2-1 degrees are unlikely to get any job. We've got African kids, just like you said, and Caribbean kids who have left university with first and 2-1 degrees, cannot get a job in this society that we're in. This was after they've worked so hard to get there. So racism explains that.
I can provide quite a lot of evidence that disputes that. But let's even just move on to something else. If let's just presume, that you're right. Why can't we look at other factors as well, such as culture, family structure, community expectations? Because I saw a surprising statistic today that 63% of Black Caribbean children live in a lone parent household, a single parent household, compared to 22% of their white British counterparts. That's a huge disparity. Do you not think that would have any impact at all on the outcomes for children?
100%. I'm not disagreeing with that point at all.
In fact, how much weight do you put on that then?
So what I would say is this, and this is my argument all the time from 2008 when I was starting to do this kind of work. I always said from day one that 50% of the problem in the Black community is a problem by the Black community. The other 50%
That's
is
quite a high
racism.
proportion, 50%. Because
I would say the reason why I say
let him finish in that. Yeah.
The reason why I would say it could be 50% because when you go into the prisons and the work that I do, the evidence would suggest that most of the inmates that are in the actual prisons have grown up with no fathers or don't know where their fathers are or didn't have a good positive relationship. That being said, part of the reason why we're in this predicament is the demonization of Black men in this country, going back before I was even a child in this country. So it also is a driving factor. Hence why I'm saying
But Sheldon, where does personal responsibility come into the picture here? Because you've acknowledged that 50%, is to do with the family, and we're talking about time spent with kids, financial support, all of those different factors have a huge impact. But you're still then rooting that in racism. At what point do people become responsible for their own actions?
No. I'm not sitting here trying to defend the actions of anybody. I am saying this. I'm in agreement with that family is actually just as important as society. I agree with that entirely. My argument here is we're talking about racism. We're talking about the criminal justice system. So my argument is around that. But if you're going to sit here and have a discussion around culture and about family, then that's a different program. What I'm saying to you here is quite simple. You cannot keep trying to figure out that whether racism is real or not. I am telling you as a Black man that I have grown up and many of the Black men have grown up in this country under this systemic racism that lies in the fabric of this society. Whether you want to face that or you don't, that's down to you. But let me tell you this.
Hang on a second. Hang on a second. You've made your point, and Giles here wants to take you up on it. Giles.
Sheldon, hi. I'm really interested in this sort of like the all-pervasiveness of racism that you describe. The institutions, not just the criminal justice system, but I guess, the police, the NHS, all sorts of institutions. Would you recognise that racism is pervasive across all these sorts of organisations?
100%.
Yeah.
There's not a agency or government department or any corporation in this country that is not systemically racist. And I'm talking local authorities, NHS, the police service, we're talking the fire service, we're talking the education, the whole, and that's the problem with society.
Yeah.
Because
can I ask you a question about it? You're really clear about that. It's really important. I really appreciate the work that you do, the pastoral work that you do with the people that you work with young black guys and so forth. How do you give them some hope in a situation that seems to be so bleak, the way you describe it? Doesn't this bleakness in the end just become immobilizing?
Yes, it can do. But one of the things I've done was use my own life as an example that we can, within a system that doesn't like us particularly, and doesn't want us to succeed, you can succeed. Now, I use me and my wife as an example of sustainable family, married for 30 years. I'm quite educated. I left school with no qualifications because I was a gang member. And then I got myself educated because of the help of Diane Abbott and Bernie Grant at that time. So I got myself educated. So I find a way to give them a message. But at the same time, it is bleak, because I'm actually telling them something that they have to literally climb a mountain to even achieve it, and I'm not sure if they've got the mental strength.
I'm just worried about. I'm worried about when you say something like the NHS is institutionally racist. Is that I can imagine there'll be people who. Some of the people that you work amongst who might hear you saying that and feel more reluctant to access some of the care they need or vaccine or something like this from that message?
Well, the reality is, it's no point. And this is the thing about the British society. They are deluded. They want to believe we're a multicultural society. You ask any black man in my age group right now, and they will tell you we're not a multicultural society. A multicultural society is inclusive. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't mean when I go for a job interview and I've got a 2-1 degree that the person sitting interviewing me, I have to sit there wondering if he or she's got any racial tendency that will stop me from getting the job. That's what it's like being a black man in this country, or a black woman. We have to sit there deciding, is this person going to choose me based on my qualifications or based on my color of my skin? I don't see white people having to do that. I don't see no other race having to sit at a job interview thinking about those kind of questions. So when you say to me about we're trying to justify whether racism actually exists or pervasive, then that's just a ridiculous argument. And it's a typical argument that is presented by white people who have never been discriminated the way black people have. And that is the problem in the society we're in.
Sheldon, and you've made your point very powerfully. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our last witness is Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who's author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. He's on the line now. Dr. Ehsan, you've done a lot of research on this. Is the fact that there are disproportionately more black people and Muslims in prison down to racism, do you think?
Michael, I wouldn't say that is necessarily down to racism. I think there's a variety of factors at play here. And I actually think that I contest the view that there are actually a disproportionate representation of Muslims in the prison population. It doesn't really take into account that British Muslims have a relatively youthful profile, which is traditionally associated with risk-taking behaviours which can feed into law breaking. And I think that it's really interesting that we're even talking about Muslims, because you actually look at the figures from June 2023, Buddhists are more disproportionately represented in the prison population when compared to Muslims, when you compare that to the proportion of the general population. And I think the reason for that is because actually what's driving some of these figures is the fact that prisoners who may not be Muslim or Buddhist, when they enter the prison estate, they convert to those religions. And that would be feeding into that data.
Okay. Tim Stanley.
Hi. Is it not in the nature of a multicultural society that in order to make it work, you want to treat everyone the same, but because it's a multicultural society, to make it work, you have to treat everyone a little bit differently because they are different?
I think that's one of the main critiques of multiculturalism, in that because we have a culturally diverse society, does that mean that that cultural diversity is recognised and indeed reflected in terms of how justice is administered? And I think that one of the problems with the Sentencing Council, there is evidence which suggests that there are lengthier and more robust sentences handed to ethnic minority offenders for equivalent crimes.
Right.
And I suspect that the Sentencing Council was looking to remedy that, but I think it went too far in the other direction, Tim. And I think that when you look at some of the, if I just make this point very quickly, I think that when you look at the pre-sentencing reports, as you know, that the list of cohorts is very long. But I think that the risk here is that if you have pre-sentencing reports which are ultimately ordered on the grounds of a perpetrator coming from an ethnic, cultural or faith minority community, that could place a further strain on community relations, and it taps into those perceptions of two-tier governance.
Right. What about minority people's perceptions? A lot of the programme this evening, I notice whenever we discuss racism, it always comes back to what do white people feel. White people will be annoyed by the perception of a two-tier system. Isn't there a risk if, in a multicultural society, you don't try and fix disparities like this, that actually you'll really alienate ethnic minorities? And we'll be back to a situation like in the 1980s when the police had a reputation as being racist, and there were, as a result, riots. Just to keep a lid on things, to maintain the peace, don't we have to address people's perception that the system is biased against them?
And indeed, we had around that time we had the Scarman Review into policing and criminal justice. I think that if you actually look at ethnic minority polling, there are concerns and reservations over how institutions perform when it comes to being balanced and fair. But there is also that point that if you actually look at the surveys, ethnic minorities ultimately want fairness. And I think the issue here is when you look at these new sentencing guidelines, it doesn't look like fairness to me. Unfortunately, it runs the risk of certain groups being treated as the beneficiaries of preferential treatment. And if you actually look at survey data for British ethnic minority communities, the emphasis tends to be on fairness, but there's a real skepticism of being the beneficiaries of preferential treatment, which generally the majority of ethnic minority people are against.
But I guess that I do think that someone who is, for instance, a drug addict or someone who is abused by a parent, I do think they should get preferential treatment. Don't you?
Well, I think, but do you not think, Tim, that that's indulging in the bigotry of low expectations?
No, not if they're a drug addict or the victim of child abuse. Their situation is low. I'm lowering my expectations to where these poor people are, and it makes sense to me to regard their crime as being in a different nature. But
then people who might have also suffered in their lives but have stuck to the rule of law and they're respectful of the rule of law might find that patronising and condescending. How would you approach that?
Leave that question hanging in the air. Ash.
Hey, Rakib.
Hi, Ash.
Just to broaden it out a little bit, what do you think is required for people to have trust in the criminal justice system?
Oh, God, where would you even start? I think that, firstly, if you look at the criminal justice system more widely, I think that there needs to be a rebuilding of police-community relations. I think that there's been a real breakdown in trust in recent times. But I think that quite often when we look at police-community relations, we quite often look at that through the prism of race. And I think it's something that I think even the two of us have discussed previously. I think class, there is an intersection between race and class, but I think social class gets missed from a lot of these discussions. And I think that's largely because when you look at existing equalities legislation, social class, perhaps because it's actually incredibly hard to define and people may frame it in very different ways, it's not even stated as a protected characteristic. And when you look at the new sentencing guidelines, there is a strong emphasis on protected characteristics. There's a great deal of talk about ethnicity, religion, and belief, and I think that also transgender people are also listed as a cohort as well. So I think that what we'll start with is how do we actually rebuild police community relations? I think that would be a big step towards that.
So I agree with you on the point about social class, but I suppose just probing this point about police and community relations, there are lots of people from ethnic minority backgrounds and also working class backgrounds more generally, who will have had lots of negative experiences with the police. So repeatedly being stopped and searched on flimsy pretexts, being manhandled, seeing that happen to friends and to family. And there was that awful case of Child Q, that teenage girl in Hackney who was strip searched by police who were looking for cannabis and didn't find any. And what do you think that does to people being able to trust that the system will treat them fairly? You said fairness is important to ethnic minorities, but what about that trust that they'll be treated fairly?
It would do a great deal of damage, and I think that when police forces clearly have got it wrong, they should issue an apology to society at large, but particularly those who may have felt particularly sensitively those experiences. But I think when you come to stop and search, I think that there will be those who will make the argument that this is a useful tool in terms of trying to minimise crime, especially knife-related crime. And I think that this is the issue, Ash, is that when you look at London, for example, black people constitute 13% of London's population, but it also constitutes 45% of London's knife murder victims, 61% of knife murder perpetrators, and 53% of knife crime perpetrators.
Sure, but the majority of stop and searches
Actually, if I could kindly make more point, I think we need to talk about why those disparities exist to begin with, and I think that also helps with the criminal justice system. If we can actually tackle the root causes of crime, we need to talk about how certain cultures, for example, might actually glorify violence, glorify hyper-materialism. And I think that ultimately looking at family dynamics and community norms, I think that's a very important part of the conversation as well.
If I could just jump in here, because you mentioned stop and search. The majority of stop and searches are conducted for simple possession, right? Suspicion of simple possession of drugs. Not knives, not guns, simple possession of drugs. What we know from the crime survey in England and Wales is that white people are more likely than people of colour to self-report having used drugs. And just speaking anecdotally, my white mates love to get on it. So we've got a...
I'm sure they do.
In order to be friends with me, they have to. But we've got a situation here where disproportionately you've got ethnic minorities being stopped for simple possession of drugs, and yet we've got white people self-reporting that they're more likely to commit that particular crime. Now, no matter where you stand on decriminalisation or drugs legislation, that seems topsy-turvy, right? That's very different from the picture you described with violent crime.
I think that I'd contest the use of the term ethnic minority there, because I think there'll be differences in terms of communities being stopped and searched, depending if those communities are of Chinese origin, Indian heritage, Black African heritage, or Black Caribbean origin. I think it's really important to tease out those differences. Now, of course, police forces, they should be looking at the effectiveness of their policing techniques very regularly. And I think that if there are incidents where they have clearly got it wrong, I think that they have to issue apologies to a particular community that is affected. But I think ultimately, I think that we have to really look at why those disparities exist. And I think that, of course, we should talk about how institutions can improve their performance, especially police forces. But when we're actually looking at these disparities when it comes to criminal activity, I think there needs to be some very tough and hard-headed conversations when it comes to family dynamics and community norms as well.
Dr. Asen, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Well, panel, what do we make of all this? On the one hand, a simple argument about justice and fairness. On the other, much more complex ideas of culture and societal relationships. In our first witness, Kirsty Brimelow, a barrister, she thought that the differential treatment implied in these guidelines for minorities made the system fairer. It was simply correcting an imbalance.
Yeah, I think that if it was making the system fairer, then it should be applied across the board. But what I found worrying about some of the things Kirsty was saying is that there didn't seem to really be an acknowledgement, which was some of the points other people were making, about the fact that some communities might disproportionately commit certain crimes. And I think that if you put your thumb on the scale, you're not actually addressing the facts of the disparity, which could actually be that some ethnic groups, some religious groups commit certain crimes more often.
Yes, I wasn't clear about that, Tim. She acknowledged that disproportionate numbers of certain groups in prison, and she said they had a rough deal. I didn't really get much further with that.
I suspect she would say that it's not the job of the judiciary to fix the stuff, quote unquote, upstream or downstream. And if you have an institution which is then committed to a racially fair outcome, then you do the bit which you can do, which in this case is tinkering with the sentences. But I come back to, I think much of this debate has been misrepresented because the updated guidelines were not just about race. No. And I find it very funny that we keep coming back to race. I think there's been a really good discussion, and I think it boils down to two questions. One, are there ever mitigating circumstances in a crime? Which, by the way, our second guest seemed pretty clear there weren't. And then the second question is...
Well, you didn't go quite that far, but...
Very few. Very few.
Okay.
Very, very few. So, one, is there mitigating circumstances for crime? And two, is race one of them?
I think he made a really good point, actually. It was a really strong point, and I hadn't thought of it before. Not only that if you actually put your thumb on the scales of justice in a particular way, then what you're saying about, because somebody's in a particular sort of group, then you're sort of implying that particular groups don't have the same degree of moral agency. That was what he said. Now, I thought that was really quite strong, and what that implies is that you're saying basically they couldn't help it because they are an X, whatever the group is. Now, is that really what we want to be saying about certain sorts of groups? Does that actually denigrate certain groups rather than support them?
I mean, so the first thing which was so interesting about Henry Hill is that there was something very binary in his thinking. So he's had perpetrators of crime on the one hand and victims of crime on the other, whereas, of course, many perpetrators of crime have themselves been victims of some other kind of crime. And I think this is the thing we were trying to discuss is, does that experience of victimhood or trauma, does that mean that maybe they couldn't make moral choices in the same way that those of us who haven't had those traumas? And I still think that that's a live discussion. The second thing, and I don't think we necessarily got there, is that you're talking about the justice system putting its thumb on the scale with regards to preferential sentencing. What about the justice system putting its thumb on the scale with regards to who is considered suspicious in the first place? So if you've been trailed around shops since the age of 11 because you're suspected of shopkeeping, and then you do something that lots of kids do, like you pocket a lip gloss, or maybe you've got a small quantity of cannabis, and you're likely to be criminalised from that early age, and then that colours the rest of your life chances and your likelihood of being caught up in the criminal justice system later down the line. That's an example of the criminal justice system putting its thumb on the scale because it considered you worthy of suspicion in the first place.
Inaya.
I think Tim's point was quite interesting in relation to why is it that race has become so explosive. But I think it's a fairly simple reason. I think a lot of people can sympathise with something that is a circumstance, being pregnant or being responsible for caring for elderly people. But I think that's very different to an immutable characteristic that essentially nobody can change, which is really happenstance. And I think that's really what people find quite corrosive, which is embedding the differential treatment based off of identity markers.
Tim.
Well, I suspect that people would reply that part of the reason why black people get worse sentences is because they tend to plead innocent. They don't do a deal. So when it comes to the report, that racial background would be an example of where they perhaps have taken a decision that is framed by race. But one reason why I raised the issue of sin with Henry is because, Giles, you're a priest. If someone comes to you and says in confession, I don't know how you do it, but if someone comes to you in confession and says, I've stolen something, they've committed a sin and they are to be punished with it. If they keep coming back to you and say, I keep stealing, you will begin to have a conversation with them, won't you, about why do you keep stealing? And if the answer is because I'm starving or I'm an addict, that does change the nature of the punishment, doesn't it? And what you would expect.
But I'm not
Christian
punishing
priest.
people. It isn't about punishment. It's actually about their soul, if you like, and that's a conversation. But that's not what judges are interested in, and they shouldn't be either. They're interested in the administration of justice, which is about the protection of the public and the imposition of justice, and that seems to be pretty right.
Ash, can I just drag it back to fairness and the sentencing guideline, the pre-sentence report? I thought it was a rather good point. I can't remember who made it now. That if these things, certainly our first witness was saying, how important they were, the background and potential mitigating circumstances that they brought up. If they're so great, why doesn't everybody get them?
Well, to be honest, I think...
And then you'd be no question about unfairness.
To be honest, I think everybody should. I think everybody should. And I think that judges should be compelled to look at the whole circumstances of somebody's life. And as Kirsty Brimelow said, that's not always going to play in favour of the defendant. Because if the judge has to consider, all right, well, you've had 70 convictions for this thing and you haven't changed your ways, that's not going to be great for the defence.
But you see, does that open up? I'm a posh boy. I went to posh school, got beaten at school. I had a really hard time. That's why I did it, my lad. And I want you to think about it. I want you to think about this as a mitigating factor.
Sure.
I mean, anything sort of, this opens the floodgates for any sort of mitigation, which may well be okay, but I just feel that there's a level of, we're inviting the probation service to be psychotherapists and...
A lawyer can present anything they want as mitigating circumstances. They can present, my lord, his goldfish died when he was 5. The judge doesn't have to accept it. And so I think that just because we say judges have to take into account this whole person's life, that doesn't mean they have to accept that everything's a good excuse.
Inaya, I think Henry Hill was raised the point that... because he didn't like these sentencing guidelines. He said something along the lines of that if there's no evidence that we're prosecuting the innocent or failing to prosecute people like white Christians who are actually guilty, then those are the only things that matter.
Yeah, no, I think that he was absolutely right there. And I think that one of the points that he made, which I thought was quite compelling, if we're saying that all of these circumstances necessarily make somebody more likely to commit a crime, then actually some people might perceive that as then those people are more dangerous.
Yeah.
And therefore they should receive harsher sentences because the public need to be protected from them more. So actually the assumption that people then perceive that these people should then be treated more lightly is not necessarily across the board.
A crime and being caught committing a crime are two different things. And that's important.
Tim, the second half of the programme, Sheldon Thomas didn't mince his words, did he? It's all unfair and all because our society is riddled from top to bottom with racism. Though, what do you make of that argument?
Well, first of all, I did notice that his solutions were family and education. I thought it was really interesting. He's a natural conservative. He's a natural Maggie Thatcher fan. And it's and quite often for conservatives, it's really tragic that race becomes this block between ethnic minorities and conservatism, because actually much of what conservatives want is what ethnic minorities want too. Yeah. The problem I have with...
If he's still listening to the programme,
he'll be furious. But the problem I have with what he was saying is, on what basis do we build a harmonious, equal society if there's this working assumption that I hate him because he's black? On what basis can we build a better society if one enters every discussion assuming that the other side literally despises you?
But this point about family is so important, because one thing which disrupts families and tears them apart is also prisons. And I'm not saying, just before anyone leaps in, that anyone who's got kids shouldn't be in prison. But that does mean, when you're thinking about the protection of society and the good of society, you also have to think about the downstream impacts of somebody being incarcerated. Does that mean kids lose their primary carer? Does it mean they lose access to their father? So on and so forth. That doesn't mean that you should never be held accountable. But when you're thinking about harm, doesn't that have to be taken into account?
Well, I think some people might think that if you're a primary caregiver and committing, violent offences, then maybe, that's also something to consider as well. But one of the things that I worried about was that he seemed to be conflating so many, socioeconomic factors. So he gave the example of people that have got degrees and, ended up working in what they might perceive of as a dead-end job. But this is a structural problem in our entire economy that is affecting people regardless of race. And actually, when you just focus on race, I think you're breaking the divides or breaking the bridges of people that actually share a lot of the same challenges because you're just thinking about it through a racial lens.
Giles Sheldon did acknowledge, didn't he, that he thought 50% of the problem was down to problems within the community itself of fatherless families in one sort or another. And Dr. Ehsan was also talking about gang culture, about materialism and drawing distinctions between different ethnic minority groups.
Yeah, and, if you look at one of the things that's really difficult to explore is whether there is a connection between particular sorts of crimes and particular sorts of groups, and whether there's a connection between, fraud, whether fraud is a white crime, or the pornography and is generally speaking disproportionately. Pornography of
child abuse images
and that sort of thing is disproportionately a white sort of crime. And one of the problems with this conversation is, I certainly feel almost I just stop. I can't go any further in talking about it because it feels I don't quite have the right to say, and I think quite a lot of people feel they don't have the right to say these things, and that becomes really complicated.
Nash.
It wasn't Stormzy who said, "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." And there's something about when we're talking about ethnic minorities, we go looking for cultural explanations in a way that we don't for white criminals.
Okay, I think that's probably where we better leave it, unless you've got a last word, Tim. Nothing?
No, I've got nothing more to say.
But you had a look of total anticipation on your
No, I've now got the Folsom Prison Blues running through my head. But it's 1967 in my head.
For the day. I want to give you the epilogue. We'll have to stop there. That's it for this week. From our panel, Giles Fraser, Inaya Folarin Iman, Ash Sarkar and Tim Stanley, and from me. Until the same time next week, goodbye.